All right, all right, all right. Good evening. Welcome to the Sunday show of two guys talking history, which is usually only one guy talking history. I am Daedalus Media. I'm glad you could be with us tonight. How are we all doing? We having a good week? Probably not. It hasn't been a necessarily great week, but as I sat there putting together tonight's program, I figured it's kind of difficult to always focus on the extreme negative stuff, and it takes us away from some of the other topics of discussion that are important. So, I thought, let's do something a little different tonight. Fortunately, fortunately, I got some good discussion points, some people being very dumb, which is always good for me. Not so great for everyone else that is exposed to these things. You'll notice Nate Silver's on the thumbnail tonight. Nate Silver has a massive audience, so if he says something dumb, we're in real trouble, aren't we? In other news, Elon Musk has engaged in one of the stupidest upper management practices of all time. He has sent out a mass email to federal employees telling them that they must justify their continued employment by sending in 5 things they have done this week. So that's, a thing. Actually, it's a bad thing. So let's explain. If you've worked in a corporate job, especially, but even most low-level jobs, you're going to have a number of things that are kind of regulate your existence and your workload. There are things like service level agreements, how quickly a task must get done, either externally facing to a customer or internally facing to another department after it has been requested. Well, yes, that's another good point. What's stopping people from making things up? For example, I would just say your mom as one of the 5 things. But the other things you have is things like trackers, productivity trackers, and trackers of deliverables, and you have workflow management systems that kind of see what work is there, how it's getting handled, and whether it's getting done. And above all else, there is a level of management. Like there's people who spend nothing but looking into your day and seeing what the hell you're up to and what you're doing, and they're your boss. They're your direct superior, who you report to. The email me 5 things you've done this week isn't a management tool. It is an asshole tool. It is a management system that is designed to kind of make you feel the presence of upper management. And the reality is that you have these systems in place. They're listed as corporate best practices, really, when you get down to it. And most corporations have them because they like to all be somewhat semi uniform and engage in this sharing of best practices. When upper management comes along and says everybody needs to email me 5 things they've done for that week, do you really think that the CEO or the vice president of whatever goddamn department with 200, 300 people is going to read all those emails? No, it's just make work. They're not going to read those emails. They certainly don't have the ability to evaluate those 5 things in any kind of meaningful context within the framework of their job unless they're going to spend like hours and hours on that. That's going to get in the way of their tea time. The thing about it is it's a sign that upper management is not interested in how the company operates, what its procedures are, how it works on a day-to-day basis, and they have no intention of learning. So when I saw people on Twitter defending this as a common practice, I just had to point out that while it is a common practice, it's not an efficacious one. It doesn't demonstrate anything. It doesn't make the the workload better. It doesn't help them prioritize. That's not a systemic way of analyzing work. It's a look at me swing my dick around move from a manager. So, don't be fooled. Dodge is a joke. It will remain a joke for as long as it is run by someone who's like Elon Musk. It's worth noting that, for example, SpaceX is said to have an entire team of people who is dedicated to keeping Elon Musk busy so that they don't have to deal with his dumbass. But like I said, I don't want to make all of this everything all the time about Donald Trump because it's not fun. I want to look at other things. And one of the other things that happened this week is Nate Silver decided to weigh in on how he thinks historians should operate. And this was a interesting little tidbit because Nate Silver, as you might know, is best known for being the statistician who founded 538, the website that does election analysis and sports analysis from time to time. He's particularly well known for being able to correctly and accurately predict presidential elections by looking at aggregates of polling data. And in this, he is, he's a statistician when you get down to it, really. He's a math guy. He's not a historian. So imagine my surprise this week when he decided to weigh in on how he thinks historians should operate. It was certainly an interesting little tidbit. Let's go find it because I clipped it earlier and I am not organized properly. Bear with me. Start particular. All this is in alphabetical order. Periods and I can change. Here we go. So let's take this here and go over to the screen. Rearrange my own. Wrong screen. Picture. Nate Silver. Like, how can you be a remotely competent historian without recognizing that major events in human history are shaped by high IQ, high agency people who are bad and or flawed and or dangerous, setting aside the grammatical issue of using the concept of and or three times instead of the Oxford comma, we have some problems here, right? That kind of jump off right off the back. First of all, IQ is not historically like universal, or to put it more in historical terms, it's not transhistorical. IQ is very specific, obviously, to the creation of the test in question, but more to the point as a concept. It doesn't translate. You can't guess the IQ of someone who wasn't alive in the time of an IQ test, right? Because he doesn't have a frame of reference. For example, Alexander the Great is an excellent example of someone typically assigned in this particular role. Alexander the Great would not pass an IQ test. Knowledge is relative to the time in which you evaluate it in. IQ is relative to the time in which it's evaluated in. So you have this immediate problem right away is what is a high IQ person to a period with no IQ test? Second problem, high agency people. This one's really interestingly weird. Like, it's a weird thing for a person to say. High agency implies the existence of a low agency person, first off, and that's weird. Like, who is a low agency person and what should you be able to do to a low agency person because they're low agency? But again, agency is not fixed. Your ability to act and your freedom to act in a given situation is dependent upon the circumstances in which you are existing. So another example of a person commonly lumped under the great man theory of history is, Napoleon. He's so very smart and has this ability to manifest himself as a high agency individual. But that's not consistent in any real sense. As Napoleon goes on throughout his career, his ability to choose how he is acting, and his freedom to act, his freedom to interact or choose not to act, for example, is gradually taken away from him. As a matter of fact, after he comes back from the Isle of Elba and on exile and returns to France, the new Louis promptly scatters off, and Napoleon retakes his throne. However, at that point, the European coalition turns around and declares war, not on France, but on Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Now Napoleon has to build an army and fight at war and win it in order to keep his crown. He doesn't have the option not to. Is he high agency at this point? Is he high agency on the retreat from Moscow when his army's disintegrating? No, he's not. Agency changes based on your circumstances. You don't retain the same amount of agency in any given set of conditions. So these things that Silver is getting at are a concept called great man theory, and it is a thoroughly debunked way of looking at history. It is the idea that history is driven by individuals who possess certain innate and unalterable characteristics. They simply have these things. They simply are smart. They are charismatic. They are capable leaders. It's an old theory, and it's pretty thoroughly attacked in a lot of circles. And to be fair, Nate Silver deciding to put this out on Twitter caused him to be attacked by historians very quickly, and as something of a return to anti-intellectualism and the parts of a lot of people. And we'll go over one of those tweets here because I think it's fascinating how it displays some problems with this. And it's a product of a man named Thomas Carlyle, Scottish. He is a philosopher and a historian. He gave a set of lectures in the mid 1840, or excuse me, I think it was 1840 itself, on heroism. And he wrote a particular book, which is a book on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. And he posits a theory of universal history. That's a topic all of itself that's dangerous to kind of address. Like, you're getting into Hegelish territory. Like, what is the overriding theory of human history? Like, is it transhistorical? And the obvious problem with this emerges right away. It's essentialist. You are not incapable of learning. You are not incapable of becoming new things. For example, leadership is a set of traits and skills that put together make one suited to advance a cause of a group. It is teachable. In fact, there are hundreds of organizations across the country of the United States which are dedicated to taking people and teaching them leadership. It's not that you walk into there and you either know how to be a leader or you don't. The people who think they do typically make poor leaders because they're unwilling to learn how to be a leader. You can learn to be charismatic. There's a YouTube channel, I believe. It's called Charisma on Command. They talk about concepts of charisma. Sometimes it gets a little weird. But the concept in and of itself is that you can adopt traits that make people want to interact with you positively. So we arrive at this particular issue that, like, you don't have innate traits. You are capable of learning, changing, growing. You're also capable of regressing. You can do all of these things functionally at any given time. It's not that you are born capable. You've had to learn everything. You weren't born knowing how to tie your shoes. You weren't born knowing how to read. Ironically enough, the History Channel Oversimplified actually does a really good job of sort of breaking this down. They do a multi-part series on Napoleon, and one of the early parts of it emphasizes the fact that Napoleon leaves Corsica. He goes to Paris, he goes to school, he learns, he studies. He applies himself rigorously to his studies because everyone hates him. And then he makes another point. Napoleon is capable of rising in the way he is through the French army, principally because of the times he lives in. He is coming of age and coming into his commission in the French Revolution. The old guard, the old social orders that governed the French army no longer hold as much sway. So Napoleon is able to go to Toulon and be productive and useful member of the army and therefore advance his cause and career. And that's really what great man theory ignores. It oversimplifies things into essentialized qualities to avoid analyzing the realities of the situation, to avoid the material and the real conditions that affect and shape people. It provides no compelling answer to history because you are left with, well, some people are just better than others. This is wrong on its face. People are affected by what happens around them, by other people. That one or two rise to our collective conscious isn't necessarily because they are somehow inherently better. It is simply because the circumstances allow them to rise. So, in turn, this theory of history is bunk. This concept of great man history, it doesn't work. It's not compelling. It doesn't create an answer. You might get a story out of the concept of someone being better than everyone else. But when you do that in a work of fiction, they're just called a Mary Sue. So why, if we are to reject this in our fictional characters, should we apply this to our historical understanding? And back and forth this debate rage with historians pointing out that people don't really engage with this much past the beginning of their graduate level. And that kind of brings up a second point that a lot of people don't seem to understand what this is and how it works. Their rebuttal to these tended to work around the fact is, well, how do you talk about Napoleon without talking about Napoleon? And of course, the answer isn't that you don't talk about Napoleon. The answer is that you don't centralize Napoleon. This is one of the replies I saw that was really interesting to me. Nobody abandons the great man theory in graduate school because they likely wouldn't even pass an exam 10 years prior if they so much as expressed a belief that the Napoleonic Wars might have something to do with Napoleon. That's not what I think they wanted to say, but still. I distinctly remember being taught in a GCS history class that attributing anything to anyone in history was doing a bad. No, you weren't. What you were told is that attributing things as innate characteristics is doing a bad. We were specifically trained to come up with elaborate explanations to why things were clearly down to individual genius weren't actually because of forces. No, you weren't. Individual genius is not a concept that is innate to someone. Again, there is I'm going to go back to this well a lot because I'm still reading on more. Clausewitz has a kind of wonderful quote about this. I'm going to bring it up so I can do it for you exactly. Let's see. I should just have my damn. We know very well that this is a word used in many significations, which are very different, both in How long was I muted? I must have hit the bottom of my microphone. Did anything come out? Have you heard me rant about Clausewitz? Can you hear me now? We see Clausewitz on Genius. Let's just repeat that again. If every combatant required to be more or less endowed with military genius, then our armies would be very weak. For it implies a peculiar bent of the intelligent powers, and therefore it can only rarely be found where mental powers of a people are called in the requisition and are trained in so many different ways. The idea is that the concept of being a genius at a thing is in and of itself something that you learn. It is a talent that is developed. This person doesn't know what great man theory is. He does not understand that great man theory is not the rejection of the historical figure, but it is the explanation of that figure within the context of their time and the contingent elements that make up the situation that creates them. The reality, at least in a part, is that people do not necessarily want to look at the situation as a matter of being shaped. They want to be acted upon in a certain sense. We want a person like Elon Musk to come in and fix the government without necessarily thinking about what it takes to fix the government. We want to idolize a perception of genius and a perception of intellectualism that makes it so that we need not consider the factors that form our world and our worldviews. And that simply doesn't work. It doesn't allow us to engage with history. It doesn't allow us to engage with humanity. We are shaped and shape the world around us. That is our agency. It's not a question of high agency or low agency people. You affect the people around you. You shape their views through discussion, through learning, through sharing. And in turn, you are shaped by what people learn and with you and share with you. You become better. You don't start out as an expert. And like this idea that you are innately good at a thing is devastating to people because they can go and they decide to pick up a new thing and they're not good at it because they just started. And then they're like, well, I'm not good at this thing, so I'll just quit. When the reality is, it takes time. It takes time to learn, to grow, to get good at things. It's not a thing you intimately and innately know. Nothing is. You grow over time. Napoleon grew. Alexander was mentored by Aristotle. Rulers have regents. You are taught by teachers. And one of the other problems you end up with is that knowledge and schooling in particular is categorized. You don't go to school, and in most cases, not everywhere, but in most cases, you don't go to school and learn math from the same teacher you learn English from. The reality is that you don't have to learn that way, but it's helpful. Why? Because it lets you separate skills and recombine them. The other thing that happens is you go to school and you learn a set number of subjects. Some of those subjects you will enjoy and will be good at. And that's reflected in the grades you get. Some of them you will not enjoy. You won't necessarily be as good at those. You won't be as engaged. You are learning different things. It's not that you're innately good. A lot of people my age were taught math in a way that they found somewhat agonizing and difficult. Like times tables have to be repeated at a certain given speed. The test is timed. And to teach that, for example, you do flashcards. My dad would hold up a flashcard for a second, and if I didn't do the answer in the amount of time, he would put it away, and we would slowly work our way through the flashcards, trying to teach memorization and how to teach a test to be timed. Math was not fun for me because of this. It was something I associated with a long, agonizing process. Math isn't taught that way anymore, by the way. It's not taught to be something to be memorized. It's taught to be something to engage with. The point of Common Core math that so often seems to elude people isn't that you learn the factors or the times tables or the sums or the division. It's that you learn the idea behind what the numbers on the page represent and how to engage with them. So you kind of run into a certain way of, like, you don't have to do it fast because you recognize the overall archetype that you're working with. Addition. I take two numbers that are positive integers and I add them together, and it creates an integer larger than the whole, larger than the two numbers. And you turn around and you study how to do negative numbers. I take one integer and I add to it a negative integer, and suddenly that negative integer turns that plus sign into a minus sign, and the entire problem is subtraction. We have know so much more now than we just did even a decade ago about how people learn and how they interact with the world. That this concept of innateness, this concept of innate characteristics, you're either good at a thing or you're not, is just flat wrong. But it is still within living memory how many people interacted with their educations. So it's not surprising that Lin-Manuel Miranda here has this view. He didn't get history. He didn't get history class. He fundamentally failed to understand it because it wasn't taught to him in a way that he sees and knows. Elon works more as a hype machine than as a great man in progress. His only power is that people have the idea of a great man and support him as one. Well, that is his power, right? He doesn't have to actually be good at anything. He has to make you think he's good at things, and then you give him money. Most of his companies are gonna, I swear to God, Tesla's obviously weird as hell, as far as like how much it's worth. Like one day we're gonna see like an Elizabeth Holmes style end to Elon Musk, because the valuation of Tesla in particular is a lie. There's not billions of dollars worth of assets there. It's just not the case. It's just everyone thinks that they're going to get stuff out of it. So I thought we could look at something a little funny this week, too. Just a little bit of humor. Fancy gaming news. This is the wrong account. Tried to organize things into playlists. That way I can just pull them up when I want them. I have a history stream playlist somewhere. Stream stuff history. Here we go.
I woke up this morning.
No Ryan Macbeth.
What is going on?
Let's get this situated so we can take a look at it. Let's go over here and shrink this. appropriately. So this is a channel, Feedback Gaming. He covers Paradox game news. And if you don't follow Paradox games, I don't necessarily blame you. They are a investment in time and energy. Hearts of Iron 4 is, if you're not aware, a grand strategy game in which you take control of a nation on the eve of World War II, 1936, or if you are a wuss, 1939, and you conduct that nation through the war. It is fairly limited in like what its historical period is compared to most Paradox games. For example, Victoria 3 covers a period from about 1800 to 1936. A very long and fairly spanning period of world history. Hearts of Iron is not limited in your ability to take control of any country on the map at any time as it exists at 1936. Additionally, you can, through engagement with the game mechanics, create countries that are either totally ahistorical or actually existed at certain points and guide them through themselves. For example, you can, through interaction with the United Kingdom's focus tree, make Israel or Palestine. Or you can turn around and engage with other countries entirely. You can reform Gran Colombia. Yeah, it's not a good history teacher. No Paradox game really is. Like the way Paradox games, you interact with them, at least in Hearts of Iron, is you have something called the National Focus Tree. And what it is a set of decisions you may take as the country that you are playing as. And the completion of these grants certain bonuses, or it radically alters the direction of the country, sometimes in completely alternate history path manners. So, for example, I haven't played it in quite some time, but Germany used to start out with a pair of choices. You can continue to endorse the government of Hitler. You can remilitarize the Rhineland, move troops into that area, and start the dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles. Or you can choose the option to oppose Hitler, which is not a thing that would have happened in 1936. And you start a civil war to depose the Nazis and take over and form a new direction for 1930s Germany. The other half of this is that different countries have different focus trees. Some countries have a generic tree that doesn't really give you a whole lot of options in terms of flavor. And other countries, that typically those that have very direct parts to play in the war, have their own focus trees. The Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, America, Spain has its own, Italy, Germany, etc. Most of the Commonwealth countries. However, over time, Paradox has engaged in DLCs that add more focus trees to somewhat unrelated areas, or areas that are minor theaters that allow you to take control of those countries. That is what the upcoming DLC is. It is India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and Iran are the countries that are focused on. Why are decision trees defined at the national level? Because it's a fairly shallow interpretation of how decisions are made in countries. One of the alt history paths for Hearts of Iron that is being added is a reformation of a free India. At the time of World War II, India was a British colony. And this has this is a new update for India, and if you are play India. China has not been updated in some time. It was one of the first countries that was given a fairly substantial update in a DLC called Waking the Tiger several years ago. Actually, it's close to 10 years ago now. One of the things you can do as India is you can obtain control of Tibet. China presently occupies Tibet. With all of this in mind, let's dive into Feedback Gaming's video.
And with Hearts of Iron 4, we have mixed reviews for recent reviews in the Steam store, and we have huge amounts of Chinese mods flooding the workshop. What is happening? In this video, I'll give a brief summary of the drama. Plus, I'll talk about the new dev diary that they've dropped, which covers Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's get the basics out of the way. There's a new expansion, Hearts of Iron 4. There's a country pack that's coming out on the 4th of March. And I've been covering it with these early access dev diaries. And then I release this video. Honestly, when I read the dev diary that came accompanied with this video, I didn't see anything in the dev diary that was particularly controversial. The only thing I thought was this specific screenshot, the one I've highlighted in the thumbnail. This one. And what's surprising is the controversy has nothing to do specifically with the reason why I showed this. I showed this because it's border gore. And I know the HOI 4 community hates border gore. Hence the reason why, hence why the player-led police conference is one of the most popular mods for HOI 4. People don't like ugly borders. They want aesthetic ones. And I thought I saw this and I thought, ugh, disgusting borders.
One of the concepts in Hearts of Iron is a peace conference, and they work very strangely. You are given a score based on your effective participation in the war, how much territory you conquer, how many soldiers you lose, etc. All these things are combined into something called the war score. And then when the war that you are fighting is over, everyone goes into the peace conference on the winning side with a certain number of points, and they can select things like territory, fleets, stuff like that. It's how you resolve the conflict. Border gore is the fact that peace conferences tend to be land grabs, and therefore it results in things that look like, well, that particular arrangement of a country there. It's not necessarily logically contiguous. So that's what border gore is.
Turns out, this is not even what the controversy is about. It's to do with this, the Silk Road Empire. And additionally, India coring Tibet. And you can't see it in this specific.
So, for more context here, the Silk Road isn't a road per se. It is a network of trade routes that extended from ancient China, the Han Empire fairly specifically was where this originated, to Europe and Rome more generally. When Rome existed as a coherent political entity, and then afterwards it was, for a not insignificant portion of our history, the principal trade routes between Far East Asia and Europe. It was about 200 BCE to 1400 CE that the Silk Road Empire, the Silk Road was highly used and regulated. And the way the Silk Road works is, say I am a producer of silk in China. I make silk. It's very nice. It's highly sought after, both in imperial China and abroad. Part of that silk I would take and sell to a merchant, and the merchant would take it part of the way on this route, this trade route of the Silk Road. And then they'd arrive at another city, and they'd sell that silk to a merchant there who would carry it off, and so on and so forth until it finally arrives at the destination with which someone who ultimately wants to keep it. In this way, there is trading contact between the Romans and the Han Chinese. There's also, throughout history, a number of other things that are transmitted down the Silk Road. Ideas, Buddhism, for example, is one of them. Also, there are things such as disease, the Black Death, transmitted across the Silk Road. It is a hugely influential part of culture that belongs broadly to the cultures that interacted with it. The Silk Road only really stops being used because inertia is everything in economics. When the Ottoman Empire in the early 1400s starts to clamp down on trade. So this entails a number of European powers to look for a route that doesn't involve the Ottoman Empire. Portugal, in particular, starts what we call in European history as the Age of Exploration. The Silk Road is not a uniquely Chinese concept, is my point. Tibet is also its own unique land, currently occupied by China. But let's keep moving because
Big screenshot, but it is referenced in the dev diary. We saw our comments here by Newest First. There's a mention of negative reviews from Chinese players regarding a formable that no one asked for. China mad. My favorite historical moment was when they and this guy's comment summarizes it perfectly. With all the countries that the Silk Road originated from, passed through, and end at, they decide to choose India, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Silk Road, to form this abomination. This guy hits it on the head. This is the kind of the premise behind my screenshot. Looking at the Silk Road Empire honestly makes my eyes water due to the building of Bordigor. That was my take, okay? But Bordigor isn't new to HOI 4. Let's go deeper. Let's look at what the reviews that are being dropped. Summarized by negative reviews. You have a Chinese one, and a Chinese one, and a Chinese one. One that's not in English or Chinese. Lots of references to DLC, DLC, DLC. Let us translate. All right, translate to English. Let's go. I was planning to see how the Graveyard Empires would be updated, but I left when I saw your log. I know that India is not historically factual. If you simply add the core of Tibet to a non-historical India, I will just be angry. And seeing your updated log, I laughed. So in summary, India should not be able to core Tibet. I think we're starting to see the crux of the problem here. Kind of blown away by how long some of these reviews are. Okay, this guy's bandwagoning because he's not even referencing the new DLC. He's just talking about the DLC policy. I see a burning fire and I want to throw gasoline on it. In the final analysis, the anger among players caused by Paradox this time is itself the result of development internal conflicts caused by Paradox long-term discrimination against Chinese players. So if you're not already aware, in the PRC,
Hearts of Iron 4 is actually banned in China, specifically because of the potential to create alternate history scenarios.
Big Red China, HOI 4's banned. It shows Tibet as an independent nation and not as incorporated as a part of China. And I believe that's the same way it works for all the Paradox games, apart from Victoria 3. And there's a fear in the core fanbase that we're appealing to make this game palatable to the Chinese audience. And then the Chinese people feel discriminated.
Okay, let's just address that as a gaming thing for historical and fantasy titles as well, because it comes up. There is this concept that people make an argument, and it would be a valid one, except for some things. So, if you're not aware, Total War Warhammer 3 surprised the hell out of everyone when they announced that one of the starting factions for the base game would be Cathay. Cathay is the Warhammer world equivalent of China. Its name is literally just a name for China. And the thought was that this would make the game palatable and more sellable in China. This is a weird, essentialized racist thing to begin with. The complaints that you're seeing here in these Steam reviews are not about gameplay, ultimately. Like, understand the nature of what's happening here. These are players complaining that there is a option for India to gain what's called a core on Tibet. And a core is a Hearts of Iron gameplay mechanic. It defines how the given territory relates to your country if you control it. So this is a mechanic you operate on a lot if you play certain countries and not nearly as much as if you play others. A core is broadly defined as the territory in which your country is naturally, quote unquote, a part of. So, for example, a core territory for France might be the Alsace-Lorraine. This is a French territory. If a German army comes and occupies the Alsace-Lorraine, they do not have a core on it. Therefore, they experience two competing, semi-competing numbers that affect their ability to utilize the assets in that territory. The first is compliance, and this is a measure how the local government is working with your occupying government. The second is resistance, which is how the local resistance views and is working to undermine your occupation of the territory. These numbers relate to one another, and that's not important here. But the concept is if you don't have a core on the territory and you are occupying that territory, you don't get to use it to its full extent, and you may be able to not use certain assets, factories mostly, that are in that territory or resources due to the fact that they are damaged or destroyed by resistance activities. The creation of a core can be modified through those national focuses I mentioned earlier, which is what I assume, I haven't read the dev diary, I assume happens here as you pursue an alt history path for the British Raj that turns, how do they determine a nation's natural territory? It's basically nationalism run amok and imperialism run amok. To their credit, they've made some significant modifications over time. For example, the United Kingdom has control of a number of territories that used to be cored, but are not any longer, such as, for example, Palestine or Egypt. And this is like what the Chinese players are, or these Chinese nationalists, I think, more than players, are complaining about. Tibet is a Chinese occupied territory. It's the same kind of energy that you get when mentioning Taiwan, and China goes, but there is but one China, and it is united under the People's Party type shit. This is kind of what they're complaining about. A formidable communist China exists. It is the Chinese interaction in Hearts of Iron is largely towards the beginning in the 1930s, before the Japanese historically invade. You have a number of Chinese factions, warlords. You have the nationalists, the communists, a couple different warlord factions, and you have to, through the use of their focus trees, weld them into a force to resist the Japanese. If you win and survive, you can form communist China or nationalist China, for example. They are arguing that you have to be able to core Tibet as China. The way these DLCs are work and marketed is the only countries that are modified are the countries that are in the DLC. China is not in the DLC. It doesn't have the option to get a core in Tibet. So these are Chinese, not players, because again, Hearts of Iron is banned in China. These are people who are kind of coming at this from a different perspective of Chinese nationalism. It's an insult to Chinese honor that India can core Tibet, but China can't. And the reason for this is, I think, important to understand. We've talked a little bit about this, but over the last several years, China and India have engaged in a number of border skirmishes. Well, they're really fist fights. China lost those, by the way. China would like you to believe that their principal economic and military rival is the United States. That is very much a paper man on a lion situation. China is a regional power at best. They are a growing navy, but not a very powerful one. Their real competition is India, Japan, and Australia. India, in particular, has a navy that's very similar to China's in composition, really, but a little bit more experienced, a little bit better. And China has another problem that they are limits them in a very real fashion. China, most of the oil that China consumes for its industry comes through a single geographic location, the Strait of Malacca. Let's bring up a map. Give me a second. It would help if I spell straight right. And when we talk about when we talk about naval geography, we tend to talk about it in the terms of geographical choke points. So if we look at this here, this is the strait, and it's the area between Malaysia and out into the wider area of Southeast Asia. This is really the shortest route. Shipping tends to follow fairly close to the shore, so this is where the vast majority of that goes. If India is interested in stopping a Chinese effort, like China goes to war with someone, and India wants to stop Chinese effort, they're very close to this strait. They can cut this off and cut off China's oil supply. Then theoretically, these ships have to go all the way around and take a route through here, for example, but that can also be cut off. There is a certain level of vulnerability that China's industry has to this geographical choke point. This is something that both India and China are acutely aware of, and it shapes a lot of their geopolitical maneuvering. China, for example, has built the Belt and Road project, which is really, when you get down to it, an attempt to revive the Silk Road. As a kind of concept, like they're running train lines through places like Kazakhstan, in an attempt to circumvent the trade that run the nautical trade throughout the world, the maritime trade. This has not been a largely successful project, by the way. Like, it has worked very poorly for them. These considerations of geographical choke points in trade and naval warfare really do control a lot of the planning that most countries make around this issue. Like, let's give an example of another one, because we're here on the map. Hey, Maya. You're just in time for me to do map crap. This is Gibraltar. It is an area controlled by the United Kingdom on the tip of what the rest of is Spain. Gibraltar is a large naval base and a distinct English subculture that sort of exists in and of itself. It is also one of the most vital military spots in the Mediterranean. Prior to the invention and the digging and construction of the Suez Canal, it was the only way in or out of the Mediterranean broadly. It still maintains this fairly significant importance because the Suez Canal is difficult to navigate at times. Welcome, Bad Science Sunday viewers. Like the stream, it helps. Here's another one of fairly significant, formed by the intersection of Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland. It's referred to as the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap. Essential in understanding Soviet naval history in the Cold War. The prevailing theory is that in order to control the North Atlantic, in the outbreak of war, a World War III, Cold War gone hot, the Soviet Union would invade both Norway and Iceland in an attempt to control the significantly powerful air bases on Iceland and base bombers there to attack convoys coming from the United States and Canada. When we're talking about this in particular for China, though, China has a certain level of vulnerability that I have compared in the past to Japan in the 1930s, ironically enough. They are dependent upon imports for their energy. If the Strait of Malacca is closed off, they're not getting those imports. Their economy grinds to a halt.
Again. It makes me even wonder sometimes, are they aware that their game is banned in their country? And of course, Chinese people speak Chinese outside of China, obviously. So Chinese players are buying HOI 4 and playing it. This guy called Shanghai 666666. I think this guy may be in China. Reported to the PRC, you're playing an illegal game. Mention Silk Road, mention him cores. It's strange because coring mechanics in HOI 4 are kind of strange. You know, a core means it's an integral part of a homeland of a nation that gets access to all the building slots and all the manpower. They're the only two attributes that it affects. And it's not a core. You experience resistance, and then you have the compliance system. I think I mentioned in the dev diary that I wasn't a big fan of the way the Silk Road was done, because cores don't feel like they're a fundamental part of that said nation. A core kind of feels like the homeland of a nation, a bit like in Victoria.
Yeah, I suppose that's another way to put it. But again, that's a subjective evaluation, really. Like, when you're talking about alt history, what the core is like, not really shouldn't be affected by real-world politics. How do we analyze and assess the rate of success when it comes to a policy like the Belt and Road? Well, really, when you get down to it, is can it replace, does it provide the function that it replaces? So the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to get around maritime trade restrictions that could be levied against China if China engages in expansionist policies. This is your fault, isn't it? After science, you're subjecting me to history. Well, I guess while we're here, we might as well bring up the fact that Maya Atkins' wonderful co-host, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, tends to reject theories of magnets. And while I, as in the previous segment, have rejected great man theory, I do embrace great magnet theory, which is a theory that all great physical events are impelled by magnetic forces that are ineffable and impossible to understand.
Area 3, where other elements of the game would feel more applicable, maybe increasing compliance, maybe to a level where it would cause no resistance anyway, or somehow fundamentally connect it with a trading system, which seems to be lost on Paradox as well. The Silk Road seems to be nothing to do with trade. It's just an arbitrary formable late game, which requires also a world conquest, by the way. I'm blown away by how much passion people put into these massively long reviews. I don't think I've written a review that's more than one sentence. So this guy summarizes, one of the issues is the fictional Silk Road Empire.
I love this line, the separation of history and reality. Yes, it is an alternate history path. It is fundamentally separated from what really happened. Like, this is why I left a comment on his video kind of elucidating that I don't think this is like a complaint that you can really take seriously. Alternate history games like, okay, Hearts of Iron 4 through Start has a button that you can press that has every nation randomly choose its focuses. If it doesn't, it reacts to a certain level to what you do, but it will try to do what the countries did in World War II. That button, like, once you've done that button, you're doing a totally random game. Like, you don't know what's going to happen, who you're going to fight. You are very much like flying by the seat of your pants. The Silk Road Empire is clearly one of those things. Like, these people are putting way too much into it.
It's an ahistorical game. We have alt history paths for that exact reason, so I have nothing against this. The trampling of the Chinese territorial integrity.
Again, China's territorial integrity, the actual Chinese nation, is not going to be affected by what happens in your Hearts of Iron playthrough. Relax. It's not that big a deal.
See? The ability to get a core on Tibet, basically. He addresses the Silk Road again. So he makes some demands here. The Chinese community have only two requirements. One is to either wait for the Chinese forces to obtain a core of Tibet. I mean, to be fair, that...
Okay, here's my compromise. The Chinese forces can obtain a core on Tibet, but only Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Mao Zedong cannot get a core on Tibet.
That probably will happen at some point when they rework China again. China, the warlord system, is in desperate need of a rework. The complexity of China is definitely not in the current base game of HOI 4. And then completely remove the Silk Road Empire. Interesting requests. Let's find out how Paradox are changing the way India works to address these concerns. So, the latest dev diary, which is about Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, halfway through this dev diary, which is kind of interesting, they didn't stick it at the very top. It's almost like, once again, there's a little bit of appeasement going on to the Chinese audience, but not wanting to directly stick it in the face of the core audience of HOI.
We don't really need to go through how they change it. The long and the short of it is, the complaint is, in and of itself, silly. Yes, okay. Avery is very desperate to go potty right now, and I am ready to move on to the next segment, which will be a reaction to Brandon Fischella's video here.
I've made 2 videos before about arguments that relate
Stop!
to...
Bad. However, we're going to take a short break. I will be back in about 5 minutes, and we will continue on. Right. Back. Everybody stretched your legs. So if you're not familiar with Brandon F., he is a history YouTuber. He started out doing reenactment videos, like talking about his experiences as a redcoat reenactor. He's since expanded out into starting to doing a lot of really interesting things with primary sources, kind of from the same period as the American War for Independence, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. And he's done a couple of these rhetorical argument videos, and this one talks about a particular form of an argument that I think we're all familiar with. And that is the concept of connecting two unrelated concepts and presenting them as obstacles to one another. And what do I mean by this? So I think we're very familiar with this particular form that people take as we shouldn't take in migrants if we have homeless veterans. You immediately ask, well, what does the one have to do with the other? A migrant can be processed and cared for, and we can address homeless veterans. We can do so if we choose to. We don't, but we could. And the idea is to place the migrant as taking from the veteran who is homeless, taking resources away, that there's a finite amount. It is a connection of two things that do not necessarily connect. And it appeals, it contains within it a certain override, emotional override that it is designed to appeal to. You think veterans are important, right? The fact that there are homeless veterans is sad, right? Well, why should we take in anyone else and when we cannot help our own? And there's a lot to unpack in any of those arguments, but that's the basic form. So with that, I think we can get into it.
From a barrel in particular, and how you can support it all by visiting our website, nativeoak.org.
And while I don't dislike Brandon F., he has a certain way of speaking that I would define at best as a feat. But I like Brandon F. If you see Brandon F. out in the wild of the internet, you should tell him he should be friends with me. But he's not paying me, so I'm not putting up his ads.
Now let's get to that argument, which shall come to us from a barrel. In particular, this 1832 political cartoon featuring our proud abolitionist in the center, gesturing to the free English on his right and a poor, wretched slave family on his left. Think of the poor, suffering African called a slave, he says, unpossessed of any of the rights and privileges that you enjoy while you sit under the vine of your reform bill and the fig tree of your Magna Chart. He knows nothing of such blessings. Yet, when we look to the Britons with their civil liberties and their freedom, we see them destitute. Must an industrious and honest man starve, asks the wife, while the husband laments his poor wages and broken body? Yes, he says, unless he should take on the role of a beast hauling a cart, which, at the least, is fed by the parish. Their furniture is broken, and at their feet pile up the dreaded tax bills. Now compare this to the condition of the African slaves.
All right, fair warning, this gets a little, racist. It's not his cartoon, though.
Smiling amidst exotic fruits while their compatriots sing and dance in the background. They speak not of taxes and labor and starvation, but of their happy child. This one's gonna be tricky. Pickaninny.
Look, I've had the exact same feeling before I've dived into some of these documents, like, no good.
The father says, you eat yam, you belly full? Him beauty, Lila. To which the mother affirms, Sambo, he berry like you.
Also, there's the drawing of the lips and,
Not to unpack there, but the argument itself is fairly straightforward. Idealists will cry out about lofty-minded ideals like freedom and liberty from their soapboxes, or barrels, as it were, all the better to just drive home how crazy those abolitionists are. Yet, they are disconnected from the reality on the ground.
There's a couple other things I want to draw your attention to here in this political cartoon. On the bottom, you have, on the side where the English peasants are, the word slavery. And over here, where the enslaved Africans are, you have the word freedom. The implication being that the trappings of existence as an individual in a society in which you have these responsibilities and this requirement to feed yourself is in a form of enslavement, and that the Africans are carefree. Look, they're dancing in the background. And this is a particular to the English abolitionist movement. But it is worth noting, again, because he won't make the point explicitly. He does elsewhere, but he won't make this point explicitly. That's the slavery of the West Indies is particularly brutal, destructive. Like, you had a life expectancy for an enslaved person of 3 months. It was horrific. The creation and consumption of slaves at this rate was just monstrous. So this, on the face of it already, this ignores the circumstance that defines West Indies slavery. But it also, you see how it takes that form of the argument we described earlier, whereas in this case, the homeless veteran is the English peasant, and the migrant is the apparently carefree slave. The not at all really carefree slave, but the cartoon doesn't need you to know that in order to affect your emotion, to kind of make you go, well, why should I engage with this problem of slavery that, for me as an Englishman sitting in an English county, is so far away, not while I have my own concerns. It is insidious in its way it weaponizes misinformation, and we see it today. And we're usually populist arguments, to be frank.
This argument is appealing to the common people who are suffering. And rather than asking, why are these people suffering and what might we do to alleviate that suffering, well, instead it is deflecting that rightful anger and frustration outwards towards an external group, which is, in this case, distant and as such, little understood. You want me to care about the freedom of a slave? Well, look what fat, good freedom has done me. Meanwhile, they're over there getting fed, not having to pay taxes, having their housing provided to them. You know, maybe I'm the real slave here. They seem to have it pretty good from what I'm being shown. Alongside the victimizing, thus, of the white Briton, there's also the infantilization and stereotyping of the black African. Not only do you see those exaggerated racial features, but also in their language, which obviously is rather explicitly written to sound uneducated and broken. Again, it's just a stereotype, really. It's also a particularly tragic way, I think, to try and showcase how so well off these slaves were, you know, the happy family and all that, considering how exceedingly high, even by the standards of the time, how excessively high the infant and child mortality rates were in the West Indies, and of course given as well that it was quite common for women to be made just outright infertile from malnutrition and overwork. Now, if you'd like to learn more on that topic, about the reality of slaves in the West Indies during this time period, you'll find my last video on the topic linked below, including a few sources for my claims just now. So like I said, we have here a mixture of ideology, in this case the meaning of freedom itself alongside racialism, and practical concerns as well, the material concerns, the value of that liberty and
I'll be frank, I don't necessarily think this is a mixture of ideology. It is, however, a exploration of perception. And it is trying to twist the perception of an individual into not supporting the abolitionist. You obviously, freedom is a philosophically contentious position, what it means to be free. And this works on that level. It says, are you free if you have to pay taxes? Which is an argument you might see a modern libertarian make. He forgot to mention the children being ripped from their mothers and sold elsewhere. That is not a factor in West Indies slavery. It is much more significantly a factor in Southern American plantation life. By and large, most of the women who are enslaved in the West Indies will not have children. Or if they do, they will die quickly. They like, you don't necessarily have that situation emerging that often. It is, like I said, it's horrific, and the concept of West Indies slavery is about consumption. It consumes the lives of these people quickly towards the end of creating sugar, which is made by sugarcane. Dangerous, to be frank. Like, you boil sugar sap and it becomes like napalm when you get down to it. That gets on you and it will burn straight through your skin and your muscle and possibly your bone, and you will get infected and you won't be cared for and you will die. It's horrible.
And what it means in the pursuit of a happy life, you know, aka what use is a liberty if I'm starving to death, right? What this is, effectively, right, is a Georgian-era stone toss cartoon. It's an appeal to emotion and stereotypes that help the viewer to feel like they're being practical. They're understanding the issue on a deeper level, not just engaging in these useless platitudes. And yet, it totally falls apart the moment you examine the actual conditions on the ground, you know, infant mortality, starvation, overwork, all that stuff, or the moment you refuse to accept the assumptions that are at its core. In this case, and also in the case with the stone toss as well, the assumption of racial superiority, even just existing as a concept, right? And you know, ultimately, even if the slaves were all happy and prosperous and everything, you know, even if the way that the cartoon is showing them living was the case, very much not so, but even if it was, well, it would still be, at its core, serving to take existing anxieties, in this case, you know, about the price of eggs, as it were, and directing that anger instead towards a different issue altogether. The issue of abolition has very little to do with the wages of a workman in Britain. Obviously, it's connected, all of these things are connected, right? The global economy, blah, 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 blah. I understand that they are connected issues in a way, but it's not like it's a direct line, right? It's not like, oh, well, we need to keep the people enslaved in the West Indies, and that'll solve your problem at home. Well, it very clearly has not been solving the problem.
Yeah, that's fair to a degree. There is slavery. There's a local connection between low wages in one area depressing wages broadly across the industries in the same area. The real problem here isn't necessarily the the assumption of racial superiority is a problem, but the larger problem is that the comparison being made between the state of the English peasant and the state of the enslaved African in the West Indies doesn't have a direct correlation to one another. It also doesn't address the English peasant's concern, because they do have a very valid concern. I'm not making enough money to maintain my rent, to feed my family, etc., etc., etc. These are not invalid concerns. That's why you get Trump, because people had concerns that he said things that they thought would make him identify with and address them. And obviously that hasn't gone well. Eggs are almost $1 each now. And we're looking at a recession. So, well done.
Problem. Now, this cartoon is not outright saying slavery is good, but what it's doing is implying that there are bigger, more important issues, while, again, doing absolutely nothing, providing nothing by way of actual arguments about those issues.
Also, what it's doing is it's implying an exclusivity to the ability to address your own standing in life and the issue of slavery, which does not actually exist.
Right? So overall here, we have 3 key components. You undermine the authority of your opponent, you downplay the severity of the situation in question, and then you redirect the anger of your base from a different issue to make it seem tied to this one. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Well, it probably should, and it will, because it's a very common tactic in politics, whatever your stripe. I just know for a fact that half my audience is saying, well, obviously, Brandon is referring to this issue. And the other half will say, well, obviously, it's the exact opposite issue, right? It's a very common tactic, whatever it is. The real trick here is picking up on it, not just when the other guy is doing it, but when your side is doing it as well. You know, it's also a real trick is finding a way to fit a sponsor transition into a video like this that's on.
I'm still not being paid.
Let's look at another example of this rhetoric being used. Here we have a rather busy cartoon as John Bull takes a clear view of the Negro slavery question. While the horrified British public gazes through their spyglass to the West Indies, a raving abolitionist holds up a brutal view of a whipping, the likes of which are being sold by the crateful alongside abolitionist pamphlets and very lucrative speaking gigs. Hey, there's that bucket again. Huh. Meanwhile, of course, bookish and spindly little abolitionists are collecting signatures from children for their anti-slavery petitions, which oh so happens, of course, to encourage the trade in British East India tea. You know, you really should only be buying tea from the East Indies. It's so much more pure and moral, unlike that vile, sinful West Indian slave trade-produced tea. Oh, I'm sure there's no conflict of interest going on here whatsoever. No, don't be ridiculous, not at all. And don't you dare to suggest otherwise either, of course, you evil slaver. And of course, through this whole tragic scene, we have a poor homeless laborer whose children are hungry, being ignored by them all. Oh, these terrible, terrible so-called abolitionists. Behind the facade, behind the massive business that is the abolitionist movement, well, what is the reality of West Indian slavery? Why, it's a regular old party over there, a cornucopia of dance and merriment.
Anyone who can figure out how to fit dance and merriment into a cornucopia gets extra credit. This is a interesting form of this argument as well, too. The basic idea, and you've seen it, it's the guy who says, well, Big Pharma isn't interested in curing your cancer because they make money off of it. And it's a compelling argument, isn't it? Because medical prices in the United States are insane. You don't want to know what I paid for my prescriptions last month when my deductible reset at the beginning of the year. It was absurd. It was not good. It was well in excess of $800. I hate American healthcare. Moving on. Did you know that the alternative healthcare industry, supplements, things like that, is actually a much more lucrative industry than pharmaceuticals? Did anyone say the cornucopia can't be the size of a football stadium? No, they did not. But I want a real cornucopia the size of a football stadium. Yeah, supplements and this kind of healthcare, alternative healthcare industry is huge money. Billions and billions of dollars. More money than Big Pharma. This implication that abolitionism is a racket to try to advance the East India Trading Company's agenda is belied by the fact that slavery was a multi-million-dollar industry. Not different.
Again, we have the exact same themes. This one in particular really driving home that, being a part of this anti-slavery elite can be really big business. So because some unscrupulous persons are making bank off of this stuff, well, surely then that must mean the entire movement is completely without merit. Maybe the issue itself doesn't even really exist at all. It's just a big old money-making scheme. It's a grift. It's a scam. It's a bit of a jump, maybe there, but again, probably a jump in logic that sounds pretty familiar because we see it all the time, even today. This was a common sentiment in the 18th and early 19th centuries, being echoed in books like The Practical Rules for the Management and Medical Treatment of Negro Slaves. It's quite a book, what I can say, but it introduces itself by saying how few subjects have engaged more of the public attention or been productive of so warm a contest of pens as that of the slave trade, the proposal for its abolition having occupied the deliberations of Parliament more or less for 12 successive sessions, and given birth to an innumerable swarm of pamphlets, tending more to the emolument of the booksellers than to the edification of the public.
So to translate that out of, 18th century speak, there's no progress being made in Parliament, and it is vastly profitable to talk about the abolition of slavery than it is to actually abolish slavery, which is not unlike the arguments that you might have made about abortion. For example, it's very profitable for the Republican Party to have the issue and not necessarily to abolish abortion. Obviously, that sort of went out the window because they became the dog that caught the car with the Supreme Court, but get the idea.
Nor does that same text stop at the material concerns behind the abolitionist movement, but the author looks to what he claims is their ideological hypocrisy, describing how it's being driven by these clergymen who never seem to rely much on their own holy books, because the New Testament doesn't mention slavery much at all, and the Old Testament rather is very much in favor of it. It appears, therefore, he says, that slavery is prohibited by philosophy, not by theology, and I am doubtful whether the principle upon which that prohibition is founded may not, when urged to the extremity which it may fairly be carried, lead also to the condemnation of many other of the practices of men, which are now deemed...
And that is an 18th century slippery slope argument.
Perfectly consistent with moral rectitude.
Absolutely, people do make this argument with our environmentalism.
For who that that denies their dominion over their own species will be so hardy as to dispute their empire over the rest of the animal world. You see what he does there? He's just redirected the question, decrying the opposing side, undermining them as he shifts the debate to a different question entirely. And rather than then engaging with that debate, the one over the differences between slavery and our treatment of animals, he instead just says, well, you know what? If we carry on this line of thinking, it's going to lead to an uncomfortable place. We'll just throw it all out because everyone knows we have to have dominion over animals. Of course, it's a given. As such, we don't even have to ask about slavery because it's the same question. He's making some pretty big assumptions here about what the opposing answers to these questions would be. Personally, as someone who is all three an ardent meat eater,
Well, I think more accurately what the answer is he's begging the question. He is assuming the question's validity in his argument. And he's assuming the nature of phone issue. He's assuming the nature of the relationship between a enslaved individual and an animal being one and the same. This is not philosophically tenable. I can argue against that sort of. So what it is begging the question.
A believer in animal rights and animal welfare, and you know what? I'm against slavery to boot. Well, I would argue that he has glossed over all of these issues in a way that's a little bit much, but that is a whole other conversation. Many of these arguments were also, of course, rooted very deeply, and you've got a sense of it there, rooted deeply in racialist thought. Whether that thought be the prevailing science of the time, as indeed part of it was informed by scientific thought, or if it's just the culture of the times, which is absolutely very much a part of it as well. More often than not, really, these two elements are mixing together, right? They're always informing one another to some extent or another. Science has a culture just like any other field of study, right? It may be a little bit less susceptible to it than, say, certain forms of the arts, but
Can I zoom in on this? Anyway, it's PETA. Where do you draw the line? What about here? Food, not food. Nope.
but it's still obviously a factor, right? But my point is, whatever it is that is informing these people's views.
So this is an interesting point to kind of expand upon. What is science ultimately, and can it be wrong? And the answer is yes. The idea of science, at least one of the core ideas of science, is that it is falsifiable. It was a bad joke, don't mind me. The idea behind science is that it's falsifiable. Racial superiority largely relied on inanimate things that couldn't be falsified. It was science, but it was not really science. Our understanding changed, and these prevailing accepted ideas changed. And that's what he's getting at. Science changed better. We have ideas, particularly in the beginning of an institute's development, that are bad. To put it mildly, that we swear by. So, for example, psychology used to be homosexual behavior was qualified as a mental disorder. It's not, obviously, not included in the DSM anymore. However, for a time it was. The study of psychology moved on. It developed new theories. It took a harmful idea out of circulation. And it still maintains more harmful ideas. And as we continue to study and advance our study of psychology, humanity will root out those ideas. Same thing for things like biology. Eugenics used to be accepted by biological science. Venerology is considered accepted at one point and rejected. Science advances. It doesn't necessarily always land on the right answer on the first try.
on race and how important it is or isn't, right? These people, whether they can be morally blamed or not for believing such a thing, they typically saw black Africans as inherently inferior to white Europeans. We all know that, right? Historically, that was a very common thought. And this was almost always, obviously, of course, a core component of their arguments, which would naturally lead to many abolitionist talking points falling on deaf ears. Now, for example, the author of Observations on the Treatment of the Negroes in Jamaica has no issue whatsoever in making a comparison between our treatment of animals and of men, writing that while the Englishman might rely on an argument full of his favorite and perhaps prostituted theme of liberty, still, a Negro has no more idea of liberty, good sir, he says, than your horse. Both are equally disposed to roam at large without control, and provided they have plenty to eat and drink, they will not come near you. Take, however, either, he says, and break them in properly. Accustom them to the bridle and occasionally to the whip. Direct him to the road to which he is to go, and convince him by invariable practice of the good treatment and advantage he will experience at the end of his journey, and he will soon, unless he is vicious, not only bear, but love the task he has to perform, and instead of a desire to enjoy perpetual freedom, will receive more real pleasure from 1 day's liberty in the week than from 7. And if that is not the ultimate get-out-of-hell-free card,
Well, no, a few minutes before that you said, can we morally blame people? I can morally blame a person for comparing a person to a horse. I have no problems doing so. The rest of this is mostly examples. Brandon never admits that he never doesn't really have a counter to this format, because it does rely on the assumption of your own.
I really don't know.
Your own personal woes being important to you. And here's the problem with the argument form. Your situation is valid. If you can't afford to eat, if you're having difficulty shelter, all those things are not invalid. And the idea is that you're being given a false choice. I can free the slaves or I can eat food. This is a difficult thing to argue against, because I now have to turn around and demonstrate that the two things that have been connected for you are not connected. And it took a few seconds for the argument to be made in the cartoon, and it will take me 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes to even begin to make the counterpoint. There is more effort that has to be done to undo this argument than there is to make the argument in the first place, which is so often the categorization of misinformation, is that misinformation has a low buy-in. It has a very low effort, and it yields very difficult conversations to get out of misinformation. And Brandon, I think, has a natural aversion to turning that argument around, connecting two things in and of themselves together that are not necessarily immediately apparent, in order to advance an opposite point. For example, why can't we bring in both homes for veterans and it's just as deep and just as emotionally appealing. Compassion is a basic element that many people feel, even if you don't necessarily see it today. You can appeal to those emotions too. And we do. We do. Not well enough sometimes, but we still do. And I understand the aversion to that. You want to be able to stand upon solid rational ground when you're making an argument, and understand the interplay between your emotions and rationality and logic. But all that's great up until the point where you don't have the political efficaciousness anymore to accomplish things. So ultimately, when we get down to it, I think his recognition of this is good, but we need to start to figure out a way to concisely combat this tendency. You understand on a basic level you're being manipulated, but because it presents it in such an overriding way that validates your own concerns, you don't care as much. And we have to find a way to get past that. Before I sign off for the evening, he does have a website called nativeoak.org, and it does maintain a library of PDF files of primary source, which is worth checking out if you're interested in that sort of thing. And with that, we're coming up on 2 hours. I want to wish you all a good night and thank you for coming. Go ahead, stretch your legs, take your medicine, take care of yourselves. It's going to be rough. We'll be back on Wednesday as we are being very successful at maintaining our schedule. And I'll be honest, I am going to probably move Sunday night show back 30 minutes because I kind of rely on Maya to dump everyone in here to get an audience for tonight. And if your show runs long, Maya, then I don't want to skip out too many segments. So we'll probably start maybe 30 minutes later than we started last night, and see how next Sunday and see how it goes. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a very good night.